From Joshua chapter 6 and onwards till chapter 12, we read of the conquest of the land of Israel. This, to a large extent, is the core and the highlight of the book of Joshua. And the whole book revolves around the events and the account of the conquering of the land. Now, this account involves, we put it in simple terms, the annihilation of the Canaanite nations. Joshua attacks and totally destroys the peoples of the cities. And that means killing not only the soldiers, but all inhabitants, men, women, children, were annihilated in these attacks. We have a term for that. We call that genocide. And the account here really raises very sharp moral problems and questions. In fact, several decades ago, there was an Israeli minister of education who wanted to exclude the book of Joshua from the school curriculum, claiming that the book is simply an immoral book. Now, as you can see, as one who teaches the book of Joshua, amongst other books, I obviously would not agree, but the questions that she raises are indeed very important and sharp questions that have to be grappled with. Now, Joshua doesn't go and annihilate these peoples on his own initiative. He's following a command that is mentioned in the book of Joshua, and basically echoes the command that was already given in the Torah to Moses, as we find in the book of Deuteronomy in chapter 7, regarding what is called the Herem, the command to annihilate. We read, Deuteronomy 7, verse 1, when the Lord your God brings you into the land to which you are coming to possess it, he will cast away many nations from before you, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, 7 nations more numerous and powerful than you. And the Lord your God will deliver them to you, and you shall smite them. You shall utterly destroy them. This is the translation of the Hebrew, Herem tacharim otam. You shall utterly destroy them. Neither shall you make a covenant with them, nor be gracious to them. You shall not intermarry with them. You shall not give your daughter to his son, and you shall not take his daughter for your son. For he will turn your son from following me, and they will worship the gods of others, and the wrath of the Lord will be kindled against you, and he will quickly destroy you. But so shall you do to them. You shall demolish their altars and smash their monuments and cut down their Asherim trees, forms of a worship tree, and burn their graven images with fire. For you are a holy people to the Lord, your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be his treasured people out of all the peoples upon the face of the earth. So here's the command. You go and you conquer these 7 nations, and you must utterly destroy them. Don't make a covenant with them. There's a concern that they'll have a negative influence upon you. So like we said, basically this is the command of God, and Joshua is following that command to annihilate the Herem, to destroy them utterly. How do we grapple with this? So one can first approach and say, okay, you're judging it from a modern perspective, but in ancient times, human rights were not exactly upheld anywhere. The typical war involved slaughtering of the soldiers, the enemies, exiling of conquered peoples, enslavement. But we must admit that while ancient civilizations' attitude towards war was very harsh, not that modern civilization's attitude towards war is necessarily that much better. We've had a lot of atrocities even in the last decades. But nevertheless, even in the ancient world, the idea of a herem, a total destruction, not taking people as slaves, not exiling them, but totally destroying and annihilating, that's even harsh in ancient terms. So we can, to a certain extent, mitigate and soften the issue if we balance it out with another command in Deuteronomy a little later. Deuteronomy, in the collection of laws relating to war, Deuteronomy 20, we read in verse 10, the command, when you approach a city to wage war against it, you shall propose peace to it. Now, if we assume that this command, that you have to first call out for peace, you can't attack without offering a possibility of peace, also relates to the command of conquering the land, the war against the 7 nations, what is called a war of commandment. Then we can at least say that the command to annihilate is only following the unwillingness of those peoples to accept peace. Now, this is the approach taken by Maimonides, the great Jewish philosopher and scholar from the 12th century, in his Book of Laws, where he rules on all the debates, Laws of Kings and Wars, chapter 6, we read, war is not conducted against anyone in the world until they are first offered peace. Whether this is a discretionary war or a war of commandment. In other words, whether this is not one of the wars that you're commanded to do against the peoples of the land of Canaan, any war, but even also a war of commandment, what is called in Hebrew, milchemet mitzvah, the war that you have to do. As it says, when you come close to the city to fight with it, you shall call to it to make peace, right? That's another translation of you shall propose peace to it. That's the verse he's referring to. So Maimonides, and indeed also Nachmanides, the 13th century brilliant scholar, really believed that the whole idea of the Herem, the command to annihilate, has the prerequisite of first offering peace, and only if they reject the offering of peace, then you have that commandment of annihilation. Mind you, that's not the only position. Rashi, for example, the 11th century famous Jewish scholar, did not hold that, and he believed that in a war of commandment against those 7 nations, there wasn't a possibility of peace. But even if we accept the more lenient position of Maimonides and Nachmanides, which would be the mainstream position, well, the question still remains, okay, so they didn't accept the conditions for peace. Does that legitimate utter, total annihilation? So what I want to deal with in this lecture, before beginning our analysis, the continuation of the course of the actual conquest, is to understand the issue of the Herem, of the annihilation. What is the background to this? How are we to relate to it and understand this harsh, even on ancient standards, this harsh command of totally annihilating what we'd consider genocide, war crime in our time? Is there a background to it, or just, okay, you want to inherit the land, this is the land I want to give you, so annihilate the people so you can inherit the land? Or is there some moral backing to what is happening here? So let us go back into Torah and see what we can find in relation to this issue. So we go back to the very beginnings of the promise of the land. And that, of course, goes back to Abraham. And the first covenant that God makes with Abraham is called the covenant of peace, Barit ben HaBetarim. And it takes place in Genesis 15. God speaks to Abram and says, and he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you forth from Ur of the Chaldees to give you this land to inherit it. And he said, that is Abraham, O Lord God, how will I know that I will inherit it? A surprising question. Abraham isn't sufficed with a promise. He wants something, I guess, more formidable. And then God heeds to this request, and he said to him, take for me 3 heifers and 3 goats and 3 rams and a turtle dove and a young bird. And he took for him all these, and he divided them in the middle. And he placed each part opposite its mate, but he did not divide the birds. We won't get into all the details, but this is why it's called the covenant of the pieces, because Abraham split these animals that he offered into 2. And the birds of prey descended upon the carcasses, and Abraham drove them away. There's a lot of symbolism here, but this is not the point of our analysis here. Now the sun was ready to set, and a deep sleep fell upon Abraham. And behold, a fright, a great darkness was falling upon him. And he said to Abraham, you shall surely know that your seed will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and they will enslave them and oppress them for 400 years. Of course, hinting towards the enslavement in Egypt. And also the nation that they will serve will I judge, and afterwards they will go forth with great possessions. But you will come to your forefathers in peace. You will be buried in a good old age, and the 4th generation will return here. So now God informs Abraham, I indeed promised you the land, but I didn't say when. And now he informs Abraham, if you want to know, this will only take place after 4 generations. The 4th generation will return here. Why is there a delay in the fulfillment of the promise of the land to Abraham? Here is the explanation in verse 16. The 4th generation will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites will not be complete until then. In other words, God is basically telling Abraham, I can't fulfill the promise at this stage. Why? Because currently, one of the nations living in Canaan, the Amorites, they're the ones that Abraham also had a covenant with, and they fought with Abraham against the 4 kings. So this one nation, they haven't sinned enough, and therefore I have to delay the fulfillment of the promise and the giving of the land. Only after 4 generations, God knows, with his foreknowledge, his omniscience, that then the Amorites will have sinned enough to be deserving of punishment of losing their land. Now it came to pass that the sun had set, and it was dark, and behold, a smoking furnace and a firebrand which passed between these parts. On that day the Lord formed a covenant with Abraham, saying, to your seed I have given this land from the river of Egypt until the great river, the Euphrates River. And then there's a list of all these nations and additional ones, including the Amorites in the last verse, and the Amorites and the Canaanites and the Girgashites and the Jebusites. So this is the covenant of the pieces, the first instance in which God makes a covenant promising the land, but we're also informed that it will be delayed. And interestingly enough, we see that God cannot just give the land to Abraham. He can only give it after the resident nations deserve losing it. And that will take time. But here we can at least understand that the taking away of the land is not without reason as far as the divine perspective is, but it is due to the sins of the peoples of the land. This is further emphasized in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 9, we read in the beginning of the chapter, Hear, O Israel, today you are crossing the Jordan to come in to possess nations greater and stronger than you, great cities fortified up to the heavens. Great and tall people, the children of the Anakim, who you know and of whom you have heard said, Who can stand against the children of Anak? You shall know this day that it is the Lord your God who passes over before you as a consuming fire. He will destroy them and he will subdue them before you, and you shall drive them out and destroy them quickly, as the Lord spoke to you. Now, this is the promise. Now, look what God also adds to this. Do not say to yourself, when the Lord your God has repelled them before you, saying, because of my righteousness, the Lord has brought me to possess this land. And that because of the wickedness of these nations, the Lord drives them out from before you. Not because of your righteousness or because of the honesty of your heart do you come to possess their land, but because of the wickedness of these nations, the Lord your God drives them out from before you. And in order to establish the matter that the Lord swore to your forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you shall know that, not because of your righteousness, the Lord your God gives you this good land to possess it, for you are a stiff-necked people. So if we summarize, why does God give us this land? The primary reason is because of the wickedness of these nations, and of course his obligation to fulfill his promises to the forefathers. But the Torah goes out of its way to say, don't think you are so righteous and deserving. It's primarily because I want to punish those who dwell in the land. So here we understand that the giving of the land is actually a form of punishment for the original or the prior residents of the land, the Canaanites. So what's so bad about these Canaanites? What was their sin? What was their, how are they so much worse than all other nations that God has decided to wipe them out and to give their land to the Israelites? So we have in the book of Leviticus an elaboration upon what may have been a central aspect of the sin of the Canaanites. We won't read the whole chapter, but it begins as follows. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, I am the Lord your God. Like the practice of the land of Egypt in which you dwelled, you shall not do. And like the practice of the land of Canaan, to which I am bringing you, you shall not do, and you shall not follow their statutes. You shall fulfill my ordinances and observe my statutes to follow them. I am the Lord your God. You shall observe my statutes and my ordinances, which a man shall do and live by them. I am the Lord. No man shall come near to any of his close relatives to uncover their nakedness. I am the Lord. Right? To uncover their nakedness is a translation of legalot erva, which basically means the prohibition of having sexual relations. You're not allowed to have sexual relations with close relatives. And then there's an elaboration. What are the prohibited sexual relations? You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father or the nakedness of your mother. She is your mother. You shall not uncover her nakedness. All the taboos, right, of incest, sexual relations within the family, a long list of relatives that are prohibited in sexual relations. And it continues on, and to a woman during the uncleanness of her separation, that's a translation of nidat tumata, during the menstruation period, you shall not come near to uncover her nakedness. You shall not lie carnally with your neighbor's wife to become defiled by her, the prohibition of a married woman. And you shall not give any of your offspring to pass through for Molech. You shall not offer your children as sacrifices. And you shall not profane the name of your God, I am the Lord. You shall not lie down with a male, as with a woman. This is an abomination. The Torah prohibits homosexual relations. And with no animal shall you cohabit to become defiled by it. And a woman shall not stand in front of an animal to cohabit with it. This is depravity. So obviously relations with animals are prohibited. You shall not defile yourselves by any of these things. Now listen carefully. For the nations who I am sending away from before you have defiled themselves with all these things. and the land became defiled, and I visited its sin upon it, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. But as for you, you shall observe my statutes and my ordinances, and you shall not do like any of these abominations, neither the native nor the stranger who sojourns among you. For the people of the land who preceded you did all these abominations, and the land became defiled. And let the land not vomit you out for having defiled it, as it vomited out the nation that preceded you. For anyone who commits any of these abominations, the persons doing so shall be cut off from the midst of their people. And you shall observe my charge, not to commit any of the abominable practices that were done before you, and you shall not become defiled by them. I am the Lord your God. So in the introduction, as well as in the summary of all prohibited acts of incest or prohibited sexual relations, basically we're informed that this is what characterized the Canaanite nations. And this is the explanation given in Leviticus for why God expelled them, or in the language of Leviticus, why the land vomited them out. For this land does not support, does not tolerate this abominable behavior. By the way, we have one incident where we're given, I guess, a window into Canaanite or the culture of those dwelling in the area. And that is, of course, the notorious story in Genesis of Sodom and Gomorrah, where the angels visit the house of Lot, and then the people of Sodom, all of them, from young and old, demand Lot hand them over these guests so that they may know them. And of course, that is with the meaning of sexuality, that we may rape them, right? So we get a taste of what characterized Canaanite culture in general with the story of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19. And this is what we find also here in relation to the laws and prohibitions of incest in Leviticus. So we saw there was a description of a general wickedness of the people, and we have a little more elaboration in Leviticus as far as the nature of some of their sins, which relate to the sexual domain. And we've also we have the stories in Genesis of Sodom and Gomorrah and how they treated so malfully the guests of Lot. What we can learn from this is that this command to perform the Herem, to destroy, to annihilate, doesn't come with no background at all. It's not a command out of the blue in order to inherit the land, annihilate them. No, as we can see, the background in the Torah does pay attention and relate to this question. It doesn't just give us a command to annihilate, but it gives the background to why this is done by describing the wickedness of the culture of these peoples that originally dwelt in the land. And God did not want them to remain in the land. He wanted to punish them. And therefore, this conquest, this command, is actually an accomplishment of the divine will to punish the peoples for their very, very severe sins in the eyes of God. Does this totally solve our moral issues with the destruction of these nations? Of course, the questions are very difficult, and it's indeed true that we have to remember the background to it, both historically, as far as the different attitudes towards war in the ancient times, but also theologically and morally, as far as the biblical perspective. We see that this war is first and foremost a war of punishment. And that is why the command of the Herem is such a severe command. And that is why the Torah does not want the Israelites to strike a covenant with these peoples, even if they were obliged to offer peace it is clear, and this is explicitly stated in the book of Joshua, that God hardened their hearts so that they would not agree to any covenant or peace, because it was the intention of God to punish these peoples. But having said that, the Torah also warns us, don't be mistaken. Don't think that you are so righteous and deserving of the land. Not so. And we are warned, the Israelites, that if our behavior is similar to that of the Canaanite behavior, then you can be assured that just as the Canaanites were expelled from the land, so too will Israel.